No mail-order bride lasted 1 week with the mountain man until the fat one refused to leave. The stagecoach rattles into the dusty mountain town. The church bell tolls, whispers rise. Every bride sent to him ran away. But this woman, round-faced, stout, carrying nothing but a battered trunk and a Bible, she looks the mountain man dead in the eye when he warns, "Last chance to turn back." She doesn't. Snow beats against the cabin. He sets her to brutal chores, waiting for her to break. Instead, she hums hymns, lights the stove, and makes his lonely home warm for the first time in years. But not everyone wants her to stay. A smooth-talking land agent spreads lies, aiming to take his land, and when the cabin goes up in flames, the mountain man reaches for his rifle. Now, the whole valley waits. Will this stubborn bride's faith tame his rage, or will the mountains be stained in blood before the truth comes out? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The stagecoach wheels clattered over the rutted mountain road, sending dust billowing behind as it approached Silver Bluff. Inside, B. Bethany clutched her worn leather Bible close, her other hand steadying herself against the constant jolting. The late summer sun streamed through the dusty window, warming her face as the coach finally rolled to a stop in front of the town's weathered board sidewalk. "Silver Bluff!" the driver called out, his voice carrying over the creak of leather and stamp of tired horses. Bee smoothed her plain brown travel dress and adjusted her neat bonnet before stepping down. Her sensible boots touched the packed earth as she took in the sight of the frontier town spread before her. A single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, the general store's tin roof glinting in the afternoon light. The driver handed down her battered trunk, its scratched surface telling the story of her long journey from back east. Inside were her few possessions, some dresses, her sewing supplies, and the precious letter from Robert Rourke accepting her as his mail-order bride. At 42, she knew this might be her last chance at having a home of her own again. Two women in fancy day dresses paused their conversation to stare as B moved toward the general store. Their whispers carried clearly in the mountain air. "Another one for Rourke?" the first woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Ain't she a bit stout for mountain living?" "Poor thing won't last a week up there," her companion replied with a sniff. "Just like all the others." Bee lifted her chin and walked past them, her cheeks burning but her step steady. The general store's bell tinkled as she entered, seeking a moment's refuge from the curious eyes outside. The shopkeeper, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "You'll be Ms. Bethany, then?" he asked, his tone carrying a note of pity. "Mr. Rourke said he'd be along to fetch you for sundown." More whispers drifted from a cluster of women near the dry goods. "Too fat to manage that steep trail," one muttered. "He'll send her packing like the rest." Bee busied herself examining a display of tin cups, refusing to let their words pierce her resolve. She'd weathered worse than whispers in the years since losing Thomas, her first husband. The good Lord hadn't brought her all this way just to turn back now. The store's door opened with a bang, and the whispers cut off abruptly. Heavy boots crossed the plank floor with purposeful strides. Bee turned to face her future husband. Robert Rourke stood like a pine tree, tall, straight, and weathered by mountain storms. His face was tanned leather beneath his broad-brimmed hat, deep lines carved around eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. A beard streaked with gray covered his jaw, and his clothes showed honest wear from hard work. Those sharp eyes found her immediately. He gave a single curt nod of acknowledgement, then turned to the shopkeeper. "That trunk out front hers?" "Yes, Mr. Rourke. Just arrived on the 4 o'clock stage." Without another word, Robert strode back outside. Through the window, Bee watched him hoist her trunk into his wagon as easily as if it were empty. She took a deep breath, gathered her Bible and small carpet bag, and stepped out to join him. He'd already climbed onto the wagon seat, reins in hand. Bea approached the passenger side, where a young boy who'd been watching nearby darted forward to offer her a wooden crate as a step up. She smiled her thanks, managing to settle herself with as much dignity as she could muster. Robert clicked to his team, and they moved out of town at a steady pace. The whispers and stares fell behind as the wagon climbed into the gathering dusk. Pine-covered slopes rose ahead, their peaks touched with the last golden light of day. The silence between them stretched like a drawn bowstring. Bea watched the play of Robert's hands on the reins, noting their strength and the careful way he guided the horses around rough spots in the trail. Those were working hands. Honest hands. She could respect that. Hours passed with only the creak of wagon wheels and the soft thud of hooves for company. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher, and Bea pulled her shawl closer. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice as rough as mountain granite. 2 more hours to the homestead. Trail gets worse from here. Bea nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. I'm grateful for the ride, Mr. Rourke. His grunt might have been acknowledgement or simply reaction to the wagon wheel hitting a rut. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains when they finally crested a high ridge. In the deepening twilight, Bea made out the dark shape of a cabin, solid and square against the star-pricked sky. A split-rail fence enclosed what looked to be a vegetable garden, and the bulk of a barn loomed to one side. Robert drew the wagon to a halt near the cabin's front door. Without ceremony, he climbed down and began unloading her trunk. Bea stepped down carefully in the growing dark, her legs stiff from the long ride. The cabin's window was dark and lightless. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. Robert set her trunk on the porch, then turned to face her. In the starlight, his expression was unreadable. Last chance to turn back, he said flatly. Stage leaves town at noon tomorrow. I can have you there by 10. Bea studied the cabin's rough-hewn logs, the well-swept porch, the careful mending of the door's leather hinges. This was a place that needed a woman's touch, but more importantly, it needed someone who wouldn't give up at the first harsh word or lonely night. Without waiting for his permission, she found the door latch and stepped inside. The cabin was cold and dark, but her questing hands soon found the iron stove. From her carpet bag, she drew out the tinderbox she'd packed for just this purpose. I came to stay, she declared firmly, striking the flint. The tinder caught, and warm light bloomed in the darkness. She touched the tiny flame to a lamp wick, then straightened to face Robert where he stood in the doorway. His expression hadn't changed, but something shifted in his stance. A slight easing of tension, perhaps, or simple resignation. Without a word, he carried her trunk inside and set it against the wall. In the lamplight, Bea took in her new home. A plank table with 2 straight-backed chairs, open shelving holding dishes and provisions, a narrow bed in one corner, neatly made with a faded quilt. Everything was clean but stark, like the man himself. There's bread and coffee in the kitchen box, Robert said gruffly. I'll tend to the team. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Bea set the lamp on the table and moved to the stove. The firebox was laid ready with kindling and split pine, waiting only for a match. Soon, a cheerful blaze crackled behind the iron door, beginning to warm the cabin's chilly air. She found the coffee and bread where he'd said, along with a slab of salt pork and some dried apples. As she worked to prepare a simple meal, she heard him moving around outside, the comfortable sounds of horses being cared for, water being drawn from the well. Thank you, Lord, she whispered, her hands busy with coffee pot and skillet, for bringing me to where I'm needed. Give me strength to weather whatever comes. The lamp's warm glow reached into the cabin's corners, pushing back the mountain darkness. Outside, a coyote called from the ridge, its voice rising lonely and wild against the stars. But inside, The stove's heat began to fill the room, and the scent of coffee promised comfort in this high, harsh place. Bee squared her shoulders and reached for 2 tin cups. She had chosen this path, and she would walk it with all the grace and determination the good Lord could grant her. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she would make this cabin a home. Dawn crept over the mountain ridge, painting frost on the cabin's small window panes. Bee woke early, her breath visible in the cold air. The fire had died to embers during the night, and her fingers trembled as she coaxed it back to life. Outside, she heard Robert's boots crunching on frozen ground as he headed to the barn. The cabin looked different in morning light, stark and unused, like a place where someone slept, but never truly lived. Dust lay thick on the windowsills, and cobwebs draped the corners like tattered lace. Bee straightened her apron, determined to face whatever the day might bring. Robert returned as she was studying the meager contents of the kitchen shelf. Without greeting, he set a bucket by the door. "Water's low," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Creek's down the slope." "Needs hauling up." He pointed through the window to a steep path that disappeared into the pines. Bee nodded, reaching for the bucket. "I'll see to it. Kindling needs splitting, too." He gestured to a pile of logs by the door. "And the cabin hasn't seen a proper sweep in years." His eyes watched her, waiting for protest or tears. Bee simply picked up the bucket. "Much obliged for showing me what needs doing," she said calmly. "I'll start with the water." The path to the creek was treacherous with frost, forcing her to pick her way carefully between exposed roots and loose stones. The bucket, full on the return journey, seemed to gain weight with every step. By her third trip, her arms ached fiercely, but she kept humming an old hymn under her breath, the familiar tune helping to steady her pace. From the corner of her eye, she caught Robert watching from where he worked in the barn doorway. His expression was unreadable, but she noticed how he paused in his task each time she passed. When the water barrel was finally full, Bee turned to the kindling. The axe was heavy in her hands, but she'd split wood before, in those first hard months after Thomas died. She set each piece carefully, struck true, and soon had a respectable pile of kindling ready for the stove. Sweat dampened her collar despite the morning chill. Without pausing to rest, she found a broom in the corner and began attacking the dust and cobwebs. As she worked, she took stock of her new home. The cabin was solid enough, with tight-fitted logs and a good stone chimney. But the bare walls and empty corners spoke of loneliness. A chair stood with one leg broken, pushed aside and forgotten. On a shelf, a Bible lay untouched, its leather cover thick with dust. Her stomach growled, reminding her it was past breakfast time. In the kitchen box, she found flour, lard, and a bit of sorghum molasses, enough to make biscuits. Soon the cabin filled with the smell of baking bread and fresh coffee. Robert came in from the barn, stopping short at the transformed space. Dust motes still danced in the sunshine streaming through cleaner windows, but the cobwebs were gone, and the plank floor showed signs of vigorous sweeping. More surprising was the table, set with 2 tin cups and a plate of steaming biscuits. "Best eat while they're hot," Bee said matter-of-factly, pouring coffee into both cups. He sat without a word, watching as she spread molasses on a biscuit and set it before him. The coffee cup clinked softly as he lifted it, studying her over its rim. Bee buttered her own biscuit and ate quietly, respecting his silence. After breakfast, Robert went back to his work in the barn, leaving Bee to continue setting the cabin to rights. She found some old flour sacks that, with washing and careful cutting, might serve as curtains. The fabric was thin, but it would soften the harsh light and add a touch of home to the bare windows. As she worked at the rough table, threading her needle with careful stitches, she heard the steady rhythm of Robert's axe from outside. He was sharpening it against a whetstone, the familiar scraping sound a counterpoint to her quiet humming. Now and then the sound would pause, as if he were listening to her tune. The day passed in industry. Bee found ways to stretch their simple provisions into a filling supper of beans and cornbread. As they sat down to eat, she folded her hands and bowed her head. "Lord, we thank you for this food," she said clearly, her voice steady in the quiet cabin, "for shelter from the cold and for the work of our hands. Amen." Robert didn't join in the prayer, but he waited until she finished before picking up his fork. It was acknowledgement enough for now. Evening settled over the mountain like a purple blanket, bringing with it a deeper chill. Bee lit the lamp and settled in one of the straight-backed chairs with her mending. Robert cleaned his rifle at the table, his movements precise and practiced, the familiar click of the ramrod and swish of the cleaning cloth mixed with the soft sound of her needle pulling thread. Outside, a coyote called from the ridge, answered by another further down the slope. Their wild voices echoed off the mountainside, a reminder of how far they were from town and other people. The lamp cast warm circles of light in the darkness, making the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. Bee felt Robert's gaze on her from time to time as she worked. She continued her mending steadily, giving him space to study her as he wished. The silence between them had changed somehow, becoming less hard-edged, filled with small domestic sounds, the pop of the fire, the whisper of thread through fabric, the soft clink of gun parts being reassembled. The curtains she'd made that afternoon hung at the windows, their simple presence already softening the cabin's stark lines. A home needed such touches, she thought, as much as it needed strong walls and a tight roof. Small comforts could ease a heart's loneliness, given time and patience. Robert finished with his rifle and set it carefully in its rack by the door. He stood for a moment, looking at the curtained windows as if seeing them properly for the first time. Something shifted in his stance, a barely perceptible easing of his shoulders, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Without a word, he took up the water bucket and went out to fill it one last time before bed. The door closed behind him with less force than usual, and Bee smiled quietly at her stitching. Small steps, she reminded herself, small steps and patience. The coyotes sang again, their voices twining together in the darkness beyond the lamplight. But inside the cabin, the walls held back the night, and the new curtains stirred gently in the draft from the door, as if they'd always been there, waiting to be discovered. Dawn broke over the mountain with a crisp autumn chill. Robert stood in the doorway, studying the tree line. Without turning, he spoke to Bee, who was clearing their breakfast plates. "Firewood's running low," he said gruffly. "Need to stock up before winter sets in." He pointed toward a distant stand of pines. "Dead wood there, plenty of it. Take the rope and axe." Bee wiped her hands on her apron, noting how he watched her from the corner of his eye, waiting for protest. "I'll see to it right away," she said evenly. "I've got snares to check." He shouldered his rifle. "Won't be back till sundown." The words hung between them, an unspoken challenge. They both knew what he was doing, leaving her alone with hard labor and an easy path back to town. Bee simply nodded, already reaching for the coil of rope. The forest was quiet, save for the whisper of wind through pine needles. Bee's boots crunched on fallen leaves as she made her way to the dead trees Robert had indicated. The work ahead was daunting, gathering, cutting, hauling, but she'd faced worse after Thomas died, when there'd been no one else to keep the home fires burning. She found a promising fallen log and set to work with the axe. Each swing sent shockwaves up her arms, but she kept a steady rhythm, remembering Thomas's patient lessons. "Let the weight of the axe do the work," he'd said. The memory brought a sad smile to her face. The morning wore on. Sweat dampened her collar despite the cool air. Her hands, unused to such labor after years of town life, began to blister. Still, she persisted, cutting the logs into manageable lengths and binding them with rope. The first load nearly defeated her. The rough bark bit into her shoulders as she dragged the bundle uphill. Halfway there, she had to stop, legs trembling with effort. Looking down the slope toward town, she understood why other brides had fled. It would be so easy to walk away, to admit this life was too hard. "The Lord is my strength and my shield," she whispered, straightening. With renewed determination, she gripped the rope and continued upward. By late afternoon, Bee had managed 3 loads of wood. Her dress was dirt-stained, her arms ached fiercely, and her hands were raw. But a respectable pile of firewood stood near the cabin door, testament to her perseverance. She was working on a 4th load when Robert returned. He emerged from the trees so quietly she didn't hear him approach. When she looked up, he stood frozen, staring at the woodpile with an expression of frank astonishment. "Reckon that's enough for today," he said finally. Something in his voice had changed, the edge of challenge gone, replaced by something closer to respect. "There's still light left," Bee replied, but he shook his head. "Got some venison from the snares. Best get to supper." In the cabin, Bee found wild onions in Robert's hunting bag. She set about making stew, adding the last of their dried vegetables and some precious salt. The cabin gradually filled with savory steam, driving back the evening chill. As she stirred the pot, she began humming softly. "Rock of Ages," the hymn her mother had sung in times of trouble. The familiar melody steadied her aching muscles, brought comfort to her tired spirit. Robert sat cleaning his rifle, but his hands gradually slowed their work. His head tilted slightly, listening. Something flickered across his weathered face. A memory, perhaps, or an echo of emotion long buried. Bee noticed his spoon pause halfway to his mouth, held suspended as the hymn wrapped around them both. She didn't comment, didn't break the spell by drawing attention to it. But she saw how his eyes grew distant, focused on something far away and long ago. After several moments, he gave himself a small shake and resumed eating. But something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. The silence between them felt different, less a wall and more a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. When the bowls were empty, Bee rose to gather them. "I'll wash," she said, then added carefully, "Would you mind drying?" Robert's eyebrows rose. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then, slowly, he stood and picked up a dish towel. They worked together at the wash basin, steam rising from the hot water. Their movements were awkward at first, unused to sharing such a domestic task. But gradually they found a rhythm. Wash, pass, dry, stack. "My mother used to sing that hymn," Robert said suddenly, so quietly Bee almost missed it. His hands kept moving with the towel, his eyes fixed on his task. When she was working in the kitchen. Bee's heart squeezed at this small offering of memory. "It's a good hymn for working," she said gently. "Helps lift the spirit." He gave a short nod, and they finished the dishes in silence. But it was a different sort of silence than before, one that held memories and shared understanding rather than walls. Later, as the fire burned low, Bee took out her Bible. The leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling, the pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes. She sat in the lamplight, lips moving in silent prayer. From his bunk, Robert watched her. She could feel his gaze but kept her attention on the familiar words before her. Let him look. Let him wonder. The peace she found in Scripture wasn't meant as a challenge to him, but as a lamp in darkness, offering light to any who wished to find it. The cabin creaked softly as it cooled in the night air. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. Bee closed her Bible and placed it carefully on the small table beside her bed. Her hands, still rough from the day's work, traced the worn cover before letting go. "Good night, Robert," she said quietly. He didn't respond, but she hadn't expected him to. As she blew out the lamp, she caught one last glimpse of him, still watching, still wondering, his expression thoughtful in the dying firelight. The peace she carried seemed to unsettle him, as if he'd forgotten such tranquility was possible. In the darkness, Bee smiled softly. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from grand gestures, but from small moments, a shared task, a remembered hymn, a quiet prayer. She'd proved herself with the firewood today, yes, but perhaps the real triumph lay in those moments when Robert's walls had wavered, just a little, letting in whispers of faith and memory he'd long tried to forget. The fourth morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the freshly cleaned windows. Bee had risen before first light, determined to continue her methodical transformation of the cabin. Robert had already left to check his trap lines, his footsteps fading into the misty dawn before she'd even stoked the morning fire. She worked steadily through the early hours, scrubbing years of grime from the floorboards and arranging the sparse furniture to better advantage. The familiar tasks brought comfort, even as her arms ached from yesterday's woodcutting. Every sweep of her broom, every stroke of her cleaning rag, made the cabin feel more like a proper home. Near the hearth stood an old wooden trunk, its surface thick with dust. Bee had noticed Robert never went near it, though it sat in a prime spot for fireside storage. As she wiped it down, the lid shifted slightly. Closer inspection revealed a loose plank along one edge. Bee hesitated, her hand hovering over the worn wood. It wasn't right to pry into private matters, and yet something about the trunk's placement, so close to warmth and light, yet so steadfastly ignored, tugged at her heart. The plank lifted easily, revealing a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed but carefully preserved, protected from the elements. Bee's conscience pricked as she untied the bundle, but concern outweighed her misgivings. The first letter was dated 3 years prior, written in a flowing feminine hand. "Dearest sister, I must leave at once. Mr. Pike, the land agent, showed me proof of Robert's violent nature, court documents from back east. They say he attacked a man, nearly killed him. Pike says Robert's instability worsens in winter. I cannot stay." Bee's hands trembled as she read further. Letter after letter told the same story. Women who'd arrived full of hope, only to flee after visits from a man named Gideon Pike. Each time, he'd brought different evidence of Robert's supposed crimes and instability. Documents proving he burned down his last home with his wife inside. Testimony from witnesses about his fits of rage. Medical records showing dangerous delusions. The accusations varied, but the pattern was clear. This Pike had systematically driven away every woman who might have brought warmth back into Robert's life. The letters shook in Bee's grip as anger rose in her chest. Such calculated cruelty, such deliberate destruction of a man's chance at happiness, it was evil, plain and simple. A floorboard creaked behind her. Bee turned to find Robert in the doorway, his face gone rigid as stone. His eyes fixed on the letters in her hands, and something dark and wounded flickered in their depths. "Those ain't yours to read." His voice was low, dangerous. "No," Bee agreed steadily, though her heart hammered. "But perhaps they should have been. These women, they didn't leave because of you, Robert. They were frightened away by lies. The past is my own." He stalked forward, shadows gathering in the lines of his face. "Ain't your place to dig through it." Bee stood her ground as he loomed over her. "When the past is poisoned by falsehood, the truth matters. This Pike fellow, he worked to ruin you piece by piece. Drove away anyone who might have helped you see through his lies." Robert's hand shot out, snatching the letters from her grip. "Enough!" The word was a growl of pain and fury. He shoved the papers back into the trunk, slamming the lid with enough force to make the cabin walls shudder. Without another word, he stormed outside. The door banged shut behind him, leaving Bee alone in the sudden silence. She pressed a hand to her chest, willing her racing heart to calm. Through the window, she watched Robert stride toward the tree line, his shoulders rigid with tension. He disappeared into the forest, but she knew he wouldn't go far, not with evening approaching and supper yet to be made. Sure enough, as the sun began to set, Robert's tall figure emerged from the trees. He chopped fresh kindling with sharp, angry strokes, then carried it inside without meeting Bee's eyes. The silence stretched between them as she prepared their evening meal, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the pop of burning wood in the hearth. Bee studied him across the table, noting the way shame and anger warred in the set of his jaw. He'd been carrying these wounds alone for so long, letting them fester in darkness. Well, she hadn't come all this way to watch a good man drown in another's poison. She set down her spoon with quiet determination. Robert could storm and growl all he liked. She wouldn't leave this matter alone. Not when the truth might finally break through the walls he'd built around his heart. The silence continued as they finished their meal, thick with unspoken words. Robert cleaned his rifle with sharp, aggressive movements, while Bee calmly mended a torn shirt by lamplight. But beneath her peaceful exterior, her mind worked steadily, planning how best to help this wounded man see past his shame to the truth that could set him free. Night settled over the cabin, bringing no resolution to the tension between them. But Bee's jaw was set with stubborn purpose. She'd faced down worse than a growling mountain man in her time. The truth would out, whether Robert welcomed it or not. Through the window, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Bee's needle flashed in the lamplight as she continued her mending, stealing occasional glances at Robert's rigid form. He might think himself alone in this fight, but she knew better. The Lord hadn't led her to this cabin, to these letters, just to let darkness have the final word. Dawn brought a determined glint to Bee's eye as she prepared breakfast. The cabin's stores were running low, and she had made up her mind. They needed supplies from town, whether Robert liked it or not. "We're riding to Silver Bluff today," she announced, setting a plate of cornbread before him. Robert's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "No need. Got everything we need here. The flour barrel's near empty, and we're down to our last coffee beans." Bee wiped her hands on her apron, fixing him with a steady look. "Unless you plan to live on venison alone, we're going—" Robert scowled into his coffee cup, but Bee noticed he didn't argue further. After breakfast, he wordlessly saddled both horses, helping her mount with gruff efficiency. The morning air was crisp as they started down the mountain trail, aspen leaves trembling golden in the breeze. The ride was quiet, broken only by bird song and the steady clip of hooves on packed earth. Bee studied the countryside, noting how the creek Robert's land straddled wound through the valley below, like a silver ribbon. Good water was precious out here. No wonder someone might covet control of it. As they approached Silver Bluff, Bee straightened her spine. The town hadn't grown any kinder in the days since her arrival. Curious faces peered from shop windows as they rode down the dusty main street. Outside the mercantile, a cluster of women paused their sweeping to stare. "She's still here." The whisper carried clearly in the morning air. "Give it time. He'll scare her off soon enough, just like the others." Bee lifted her chin, refusing to let their words sting. Robert's jaw clenched as he helped her down from her horse, his movements stiff with tension. Inside the mercantile, Bee efficiently gathered their supplies: flour, coffee, sugar, salt pork, and a few precious oranges as a special treat. The shopkeeper's wife watched them with poorly concealed curiosity, no doubt storing up gossip for later. As they loaded their purchases into saddlebags, the church bells began to toll for morning service. Bee paused at the sound, her heart lifting at the familiar call to worship. The white-painted church stood proud at the end of the street, its steps swept clean and welcoming. But as they approached the churchyard, a tall figure in a fine black coat descended the steps to meet them. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his smile held all the warmth of a winter storm. Well, well, the man's voice dripped false courtesy. If it isn't our mountain hermit, finally joining civilized society. His pale eyes fixed on B with calculated amusement. And you must be the latest acquisition, holding up surprisingly well considering your substantial presence. Robert's fists clenched at his sides. B laid a gentle hand on his arm, feeling the tremor of rage beneath his skin. Mr. Pike, I presume? She said calmly, meeting his mocking gaze. Your reputation precedes you. A flash of something, surprise, concern, crossed Pike's face before his smooth mask returned. I'm flattered you've heard of me. Though I wonder what tales our friend Robert has been spinning. The Lord made me strong enough to stay, B replied steadily. Strong enough to see truth from lies, too. Pike's smile tightened. Brave words. We'll see how long they last. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Do enjoy the service. If you're still here next Sunday, perhaps we'll speak again. As Pike strode away, Robert's breathing was harsh with suppressed fury. B squeezed his arm gently. Come, let's pray a while. Inside the church, cool shadows welcomed them. While Robert sat rigid in a back pew, B moved toward the front, ostensibly to arrange their offerings of late summer flowers. Her eyes caught on the pastor's desk, where a leather-bound ledger lay open. Land records, she noted, dates and properties carefully logged in neat columns. She committed the sight to memory before returning to Robert's side. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture. B sang clear and strong, though Robert remained silent beside her. She felt curious eyes on them throughout, but held her head high. Let them look. Let them wonder. The ride home was tense until they passed the town limits. Then Robert surprised her by speaking first. Pike tried to buy my land once, he said gruffly, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Offered good money too, but that creek waters half the valley. Control the water, control the land, that's his way of thinking. B nodded, pieces falling into place. And when you wouldn't sell, started the rumors, turned folks against me. Then came the brides, his voice roughened. Each one scared away before they could see through his lies. Until now, B said quietly. Robert glanced at her, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. Until now, he agreed. They rode on in companionable silence, the loaded saddlebags swaying with their horses' steady pace. B's mind worked as they climbed higher into the mountains. The church ledger, the water rights, Pike's smooth threats, it all connected somehow. She just had to figure out how. The sun was westering as they reached the cabin, painting the ridge in fierce golds and reds. While Robert tended the horses, B began putting away their supplies, humming softly as she worked. Her resolve had hardened into steel during their trip to town. Pike might think her another easy target, but the Lord hadn't made her strong just to crumble before the first storm. She caught Robert watching her as she stored the last of the flour, his expression thoughtful. Whatever darkness Pike had planted in his life, whatever wounds festered beneath his gruff exterior, B was determined to help heal them. Not just for Robert's sake, but for justice itself. The truth would out, she thought firmly. It was only a matter of time and patience, and the Lord had blessed her with plenty of both. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows as B worked at the wooden counter, her knife rhythmically chopping vegetables for soup. The steady thunk of blade against board mixed with the bubbling of the iron pot on the stove, filling the cabin with homey sounds and the rich aroma of simmering broth. Robert sat at the rough-hewn table, watching her work. The town visit had left him unsettled, memories stirring like autumn leaves in a bitter wind. B's quiet humming as she cooked reminded him of earlier days, before Pike's poison had spread through the valley. You don't have to stay, he said suddenly, his voice rough. Pike won't stop. He'll keep coming, keep spreading his lies until what? B turned from the stove, wooden spoon in hand. Until I believe them? Until I run like the others?" Robert's shoulders hunched. They all did. Each one. His fingers traced patterns in the wood grain of the table. First was Mary Ann Fletcher. Lasted 6 days before Pike told her about my supposed violent fits. Sarah Jenkins made it 9 days until she heard I had a secret wife in another town. His voice grew bitter. Elizabeth Thompson stayed nearly 2 weeks, but Pike convinced her I was stealing cattle and would bring shame to her family name. Bea listened quietly, adding carrots to the pot with careful movements. Each time they left, something in me, Robert's words faltered, got harder, colder, started believing maybe Pike was right about me being better off alone. "You were not the cause," Bea said firmly, turning to face him. "Lies were." She wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from him at the table. "The Lord gives us choices, Robert. We can let bitter men like Pike poison everything they touch, or we can stand firm in truth." Robert's eyes met hers, years of shame and anger visible in their depths. "Truth? Pike twists truth like a snake. He has money, influence, friends in territorial offices. But he doesn't have proof," Bea said. "Not of his lies about you, and I'm wagering not of his claims to your water rights either." Before Robert could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both stiffen. Robert rose, moving to the window with the instinctive wariness of a man too often betrayed. His hand drifted toward the rifle mounted above the door. "6 riders," he reported grimly. "Townfolk." Bea stood, smoothing her skirts with steady hands. "Then we'll hear what they have to say." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin in a cloud of dust. Bea recognized several faces from town, the smithy, 2 ranchers, and the mercantile owner among them. They shuffled uncomfortably, none wanting to speak first. Finally, the smithy cleared his throat. "Rourke, got some business to discuss?" Robert stepped onto the porch, his stance tense. Bea moved to stand beside him, her presence calm but unbending. "What business?" Robert's voice was cold. "Matter of water rights," one of the ranchers said. "Papers show this creek's been deeded different than what you claim. Mr. Pike's got documents." "Does he now?" Bea's voice cut through the mumbling like a sharp knife through butter. "And did Mr. Pike send you up here with these supposed documents?" The men shifted in their saddles. The mercantile owner wouldn't meet her eyes. "Well, no," the smithy admitted. "But he says many things," Bea interrupted. "But I notice he's not here himself." "And neither are these papers you mention?" Robert's hand had been creeping toward the rifle, but at Bea's words, he stilled. She felt his gaze on her, wondering. "Now," Bea continued, her voice firm but reasonable, "I expect Mr. Pike sent you up here to pressure my husband into some hasty action, but we're God-fearing folk who believe in doing things proper and legal." She smiled, but her eyes were steel. "So you just ride back and tell Mr. Pike that when he's ready to show proper proof of his claims, we'll be happy to review them, with the circuit judge present, of course." The men looked at each other uncertainly. This clearly wasn't how they'd expected things to go. The second rancher opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again at Bea's steady gaze. "We'll, pass that along," the smithy finally said. He touched his hat brim awkwardly. "Evening to you both." They watched as the riders turned their horses and headed back down the trail, dust rising behind them in the golden evening light. Only when they were out of sight did Robert turn to stare at Bea, something like wonder in his expression. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Stand up to them. Could have made things harder for you in town." Bea turned back toward the cabin door, where the soup still simmered on the stove. "I didn't come here to run, Robert," she said with a faint smile. "I came here to stay." She paused in the doorway, looking back at him. "And I reckon it's about time someone stood beside you and faced down these troubles proper." Robert followed her inside, his movements uncertain, as if he was still trying to understand what had just happened. Bea returned to her soup, adding a pinch of dried herbs from her apron pocket. "Pike won't like this," Robert said, sinking back into his chair. "He's used to people backing down, giving in to pressure." "Then he'd best get unused to it," Bea replied calmly, stirring the pot. "The Lord didn't give me this stubborn spirit for nothing." She ladled 2 bowls full of the rich soup, setting one before Robert. "Now eat while it's hot!" Standing firm against false accusations takes energy. As they ate in the warm lamplight, Bea noticed Robert's posture had changed. The defensive hunch of his shoulders had eased somewhat, and once or twice she caught him looking at her with an expression that held more than just surprise. There was respect there, and perhaps something deeper starting to wake. Outside, the evening birds called their last songs as darkness crept up the valley. Inside, the cabin felt different too, as if some cold shadow had begun to lift, letting in the first weak rays of hope. Bea said her usual grace before eating, and this time she noticed Robert bowed his head slightly too. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Like the soup warming their bellies, like the lamplight pushing back the darkness, sometimes the smallest changes signaled the beginning of greater things to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty main street as Bea and Robert rode into town. The church bell tolled 7 times, its clear notes ringing through the crisp mountain air. Bea sat straight in her saddle, determination etched on her round face. Her quick glances at the church revealed her eagerness to examine those records she'd spotted days ago. Robert dismounted first, his movements tense as he helped Bea down from her horse. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly, scanning the street for any sign of Pike or his men. "The Lord helps those who seek truth," Bea replied, straightening her skirts. She patted Robert's arm reassuringly. "Pastor Matthews is a good man. He'll understand." They tied their horses at the church's weathered hitching post. Robert hung back on the bottom step, clearly uncomfortable with entering the sanctuary he'd avoided for so long. "I'll keep watch out here," he muttered, already beginning to pace. Bea nodded, understanding his unease. The heavy wooden door creaked as she entered the church's cool interior. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, creating golden beams that crossed the empty pews. At the altar, Pastor Matthews looked up from his Bible, his kind face crinkling into a welcoming smile. "Sister Bethany," he greeted her, rising from his seat. "What brings you to the Lord's house this early hour?" Bea approached, her steps echoing in the quiet space. "Pastor, I need your help. Those ledgers and maps you keep, the ones showing original land grants. May I examine them?" The pastor's eyebrows rose slightly. "This is about Robert's water rights, isn't it?" At Bea's nod, he sighed. "There's been talk in town. Pike's stirring trouble again." "Which is why we need the truth," Bea said firmly. "The original records will show who truly owns those water rights." Pastor Matthews studied her face for a long moment. "You're different from the others Robert brought here," he said finally. "They didn't fight for him like this." "They didn't know him like I do," Bea replied simply. The pastor nodded slowly. "The records are in my study. Come." Outside, Robert continued his anxious pacing. Each passing minute felt like an hour as he wore a path in the packed earth before the church steps. Every time someone walked past, his hand twitched toward the pistol he'd left at home at Bea's insistence. This was her battle, she'd said, and it would be won with papers and proof, not powder and lead. Inside the pastor's study, Bea carefully turned brittle pages of old ledgers. Her fingers traced lines of faded ink, following the history of land grants and water rights in the valley. Pastor Matthews helped her locate survey maps rolled carefully in leather tubes, their corners cracking with age. "Here," the pastor said, pointing to a particular map dated 15 years earlier. "This shows the original survey of the creek system." Bea leaned closer, her heart quickening. The map showed clear boundaries, with Robert's land and water rights carefully marked and signed by territorial officials. More importantly, it showed the creek's true course, different from the altered version Pike had been using to press his claims. "Look at this signature," Bee breathed, pointing to a name scrawled at the bottom. "The territorial surveyor himself signed this, and the date. This proves Robert's claim predates any of Pike's supposed documents." The pastor smiled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Sister Bethany. Sometimes he sends us exactly what we need, right when we need it most." Bee carefully copied the relevant details into her notebook, making sure to note every signature and date. Her usually steady handwriting shook slightly with excitement as she worked. This was it, the proof they needed to stop Pike's scheming once and for all. When she finally emerged from the church, clutching her precious notes, Robert stopped his pacing mid-stride. The look of hope on his weathered face made her heart swell. "Did you find—" he started to ask. Bee nodded, smiling broadly. "It's all here, Robert. The original survey map, signed and dated, shows clear as day that the water rights are yours, registered years before Pike ever came to the valley." Robert stared at her for a long moment, emotion playing across his features. Then, without seeming to realize what he was doing, he reached out and took her hand in his calloused fingers wrapped around hers, warm and strong. "Thank you," he said roughly, his voice thick with feeling. "I never believed anyone would." Bee squeezed his hand gently. "That's what marriage is supposed to be, Robert. Standing together, facing troubles together." They mounted their horses for the ride home, both aware that something had shifted between them. The morning sun had risen higher, warming the cool mountain air. As they rode, Bee began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had taught her years ago. To her surprise and joy, Robert's voice joined hers. It was rough and unpracticed, breaking on the higher notes, but sincere. The simple melody of "Amazing Grace" floated through the pine-scented air as their horses picked their way up the familiar trail. By the time they reached the cabin, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the yard. Bee went straight to the kitchen, pulling out cornmeal and her precious store of butter. Some celebrations called for something special, and finding proof of Robert's rights deserved her best cornbread. Robert moved around the cabin with a new lightness to his step. He brought in fresh water without being asked, and even straightened the crooked picture on the wall, a small thing Bee had been meaning to fix for days. As the cornbread baked, filling the cabin with its homey scent, Robert set the table carefully. He placed 2 tin cups side by side, and, after a moment's hesitation, took down his mother's old china plate that had sat unused on a high shelf. When Bee brought the golden cornbread to the table, steam rising from its perfectly cracked surface, they sat together like a true married couple. Robert waited for her to say grace, and this time he echoed her "Amen" without hesitation. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing smiles across the table. The evening light slanted through Bee's mended curtains, casting a warm glow over their simple meal. Outside, a mountain bluebird trilled its evening song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "We'll need to take these papers to the circuit, Judge," Bee said finally, patting her notebook. "Make everything legal and proper." Robert nodded, breaking off another piece of cornbread. "Next time he comes through," he agreed. "But for now—" He looked around the cabin, at the curtains Bee had made, the swept floor, the mended chair, and finally at Bee herself. "For now, this is enough." Bee smiled, understanding all he left unsaid. The cabin felt more like a home than it had in years, not just because of the physical changes she'd made, but because of the way they sat together now, sharing food and fellowship like family. The evening settled around them, peaceful and warm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had this moment. Cornbread and companionship, proof of their rights in Bea's careful notes, and the memory of their voices joined in song on the mountain trail. It was, indeed, enough. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft rose and gold as Bea stirred the fire to life in the cabin's hearth. The familiar scent of coffee soon filled the small space, mingling with the crisp morning air that crept through the window frames. Robert sat at the rough-hewn table, studying the precious documents they'd discovered the day before. 2 days' ride to the county seat, he said, carefully rolling the papers. We'll need supplies. Bea nodded, already mentally listing what they'd require. I'll start on the journey bread today. We'll want something that keeps well. She pulled out her largest mixing bowl, the one she'd brought all the way from her old life back east. The leather on your saddle needs mending, too. I noticed it was wearing thin near the pommel. Robert looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. He'd noticed the wear himself, but hadn't mentioned it. You know leather work? My first husband was a blacksmith, Bea explained, measuring flour into the bowl. I helped in his shop, learned to mend harness and tack. Useful skills for a frontier wife. They settled into a rhythm as the morning progressed. Robert brought in fresh water and checked their horses, while Bea kneaded dough for journey bread, a dense, hearty loaf that would keep well in their saddlebags. The familiar motions of working the dough brought memories of her previous life, baking bread in her first husband's kitchen, while the ring of his hammer echoed from the forge. By midday, the cabin was filled with the rich aroma of baking bread. Robert had spread his tack across the table, and Bea worked with quiet concentration, her capable hands stitching the worn leather with careful precision. The domestic scene felt natural, comfortable in a way that surprised them both. You're good at that, Robert observed, watching her work. Thomas, my first husband, he always said I had steady hands. Bea smiled softly at the memory. He was a gentle soul for all his size. The children in town would gather at his forge to watch him work, and he'd always take time to show them how to shape a horseshoe or explain why the metal glowed different colors in the fire. Robert's hand stilled on the bridle he was oiling. What happened to him? Fever took him, Bea said quietly, her needle moving steadily through the leather. 5 years ago now. It swept through our town in the spring. He was tending sick neighbors right up until he fell ill himself. She paused, remembering. He was that kind of man, always thinking of others first. Robert nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. A good man. Yes, Bea agreed. He was. They worked in companionable silence as afternoon shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. Bea wrapped the cooled journey bread in clean cloth and packed dried meat, apples, and hard cheese for their trip. Robert checked and rechecked their water skins, making sure they were sound for the long ride ahead. As evening approached, Bea prepared a simple supper of beans and the last of the cornbread. They ate by lamplight, the flame casting warm shadows on the walls. The day's shared work had created a different kind of closeness between them, built on practical things and honest talk. I had dreams once, Robert said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. Of a house full of children, maybe a daughter with her mother's smile or a son to teach tracking. He stared into his cup. After the first bride left, I thought maybe it was just bad luck. By the third, he shook his head. Pike's lies poisoned everything. Made me start believing maybe they were right about me being too rough, too solitary for family life. Bea reached across the table, her hand covering his larger one. Those women never knew the real you, Robert. They let fear and gossip chase them away before they could. Robert's fingers tightened briefly around hers. No woman's ever lasted this long, he said gruffly. But you're different. You stay. Maybe because I'm too stubborn, Bea answered softly, a gentle smile playing at her lips. Or maybe because I see what others missed, A good man who deserves better than the hand he was dealt. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows on the wall behind them. In that moment, something shifted between them, a deeper understanding born of shared stories and honest words. They were no longer just two lonely people thrown together by circumstance, but partners who had chosen to face life's challenges side by side. Robert cleared his throat, clearly unused to such open conversation. We should turn in early. Long ride ahead day after tomorrow. Bea nodded, rising to clear the dishes. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old hymn about grace and redemption. Robert listened, remembering how their voices had joined on the trail that morning. When she finished at the wash basin, he was waiting with a dry cloth for the dishes. They worked together in the familiar routine they'd established over their days together, but now there was a different quality to their silence. Comfortable, peaceful, like a conversation carried on without words. Each understood the other better now, their shared confidences building a foundation stronger than any they could have imagined when Bea first stepped down from that stagecoach. As they prepared for bed, Robert paused by his bunk. "Thank you," he said simply. "For staying. For helping. For—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything they'd shared that day. Bea understood what he couldn't quite say. "You're welcome, Robert," she replied softly. "Now get some rest. We have preparations to finish tomorrow." The cabin settled into nighttime quiet, broken only by the soft crackle of the banking fire and the distant cry of a lone coyote. Outside, stars wheeled above the mountain peaks, unchanged by the small dramas of human hearts below. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Love had begun to grow from the fertile soil of shared stories, honest words, and the simple act of choosing to stay. The autumn afternoon had started peacefully enough. Bea and Robert worked side by side, gathering firewood from the forest that bordered their homestead. The rhythmic sound of Robert's axe echoed through the trees, while Bea stacked the split logs into neat piles. They had settled into an easy routine, working together with the efficiency of longtime partners rather than near strangers brought together by a mail-order arrangement. "That should see us through the next few weeks," Robert said, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. He paused, studying Bea as she hefted another armload of wood. In just these few days, she had proven herself stronger and more capable than any woman he had known. Bea adjusted her load, her cheeks flushed from exertion. "We'll need it, with winter coming on." She glanced at the sky, where heavy clouds gathered on the horizon. "Smells like snow in the air." They began the trek back to the cabin, each carrying what they could. The path wound through stands of pine and aspen, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. Robert walked slightly ahead, his long strides measured to match Bea's shorter ones. The comfortable silence between them spoke of growing trust. The wind shifted, bringing with it an acrid scent that made Robert stop abruptly. Bea nearly bumped into him, steadying herself against his back. "What's wrong?" "Smoke." Robert's voice was tight with sudden fear. He dropped his load of wood and broke into a run, Bea hurrying behind him. As they crested the final ridge, their worst fears were confirmed. Black smoke billowed from their cabin, flames already consuming the roof. The heat hit them like a wall even from 50 yards away, and the roar of the fire filled the air with its hungry voice. "No!" Robert's anguished cry tore from his throat. He charged forward, but Bea was faster. Before he could stop her, she darted past him, straight toward the burning building. "Bea, stop!" Robert lunged for her, but she was already at the door, throwing it open. Smoke poured out around her as she disappeared inside. Terror gripped Robert's heart. The roof was fully engulfed now, timbers cracking and popping in the intense heat. "Bea!" he shouted again, starting forward. Just then, she stumbled out through the smoke, clutching something to her chest. Her face was black with soot, and she coughed violently as she staggered away from the burning cabin. In her arms, She held his mother's carefully preserved quilt and the family Bible, treasures he had mentioned only once, in passing. Robert reached her just as her legs gave out. He caught her, dragging her further from the inferno as the roof began to cave in. Together, they watched helplessly as flames devoured their home. The heat seared their faces even from a safe distance, and sparks whirled up into the darkening sky like angry fireflies. "Your arm," Robert said suddenly, noticing the angry red burn that stretched from Bee's wrist to elbow. "You're hurt." Bee barely seemed to notice the pain, still coughing as she clutched the rescued items. These were your mother's," she gasped out. "I couldn't let them burn." Robert's hands gentled on her shoulders, even as rage began to build in his chest. This was no accident. The cabin had been fine when they left, the morning fire banked properly. This was deliberate. Pike's work, without a doubt. The last wall of the cabin collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending up a fresh cloud of sparks and smoke. Everything they had built together over these past days, every small comfort Bee had added to make the cabin a home, was gone. The domestic peace they had just begun to find lay in ashes at their feet. Fury rose in Robert like a tide, dark and unstoppable. His hands clenched into fists as he thought of Pike, probably sitting smug and satisfied in town, thinking he had finally driven them away. The man had tried to steal Robert's land, had poisoned 3 previous brides against him with lies, and now this, burning out an innocent woman just to satisfy his greed. Robert strode to where their horses were tethered, mercifully far enough from the cabin to be safe. His rifle was still in its scabbard on his saddle. He yanked it free, checking the load with trembling hands. "Robert!" Bee's voice was hoarse from smoke, but clear with warning. "Don't!" He barely heard her, consumed by thoughts of vengeance. Pike had to pay, not just for the cabin, but for years of manipulation and lies, for the loneliness, for the shame, for every bitter night spent wondering why no woman would stay. His rifle was loaded. Pike would be in his office now, counting his day's profits, never expecting, "Robert, please." Bee's hand caught his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong despite her injury. "This is what he wants. Violence will only prove his lies about you true." He wrenched his arm free, unable to look at her. If he saw the pain in her eyes, pain he had brought on her by involving her in his troubles, his resolve might waver. "He has to pay," he growled. "And he will," Bee insisted, her voice breaking with another cough. "But not like this." "Not with blood." Robert swung up onto his horse, rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. The fury in his chest left no room for reason or mercy. Behind him, Bee called his name again, but he kicked his horse into motion, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The pound of hoofbeats matched the pounding of his heart as he rode toward town. Pike had finally gone too far. The man had to learn that some things, like burning out an innocent woman, carried consequences. Robert's finger caressed the trigger of his rifle, imagination already painting scenarios of confrontation. The last thing he heard as he rode away was Bee's voice, carrying on the wind. "Don't let him win like this." But the words were lost in the thunder of his horse's hooves and the roar of blood in his ears as he galloped into the night, bent on revenge. Behind him, Bee stood alone in the growing darkness, clutching his mother's quilt and Bible to her chest, watching the last flames consume what had briefly been their home. Her burned arm throbbed, but the pain in her heart was sharper. Fear not for herself, but for the good man she had come to know, now riding toward a darkness that might destroy him more surely than any fire. The cabin's embers glowed orange against the twilight sky, casting long shadows across the ground where their dreams of home lay scattered like the ashes swirling in the autumn wind. Robert's horse thundered through the darkness, hooves pounding against the hard earth as rage burned in his chest. The rifle lay heavy across his lap, its metal cold against his hands. Pine branches whipped past his face, but he barely felt their sting. All he could see was the image of his cabin in flames, of Bee stumbling out with burned arms, of everything they had built together reduced to ashes. The night wind carried the scent of smoke, even miles from the burned cabin. Each breath of it stoked his fury higher. Pike had gone too far this time. The land agent had stolen 3 brides with his lies, had tried to steal Robert's water rights, and now he had nearly killed an innocent woman just to drive them off the land. His horse's hooves struck sparks from stones as they climbed higher into the mountains. The path to Pike's ranch lay ahead, a place Robert knew well from watching the man's comings and goings. In his mind, he could already see Pike's smug face, could imagine the satisfaction in the land agent's eyes at having finally driven Robert to violence. But then Bee's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if she rode beside him. "Don't let him win like this." Robert's hands tightened on the reins. He tried to push her voice away, to hold on to his rage, but more memories filtered through. Bee humming as she worked in the cabin, her quiet strength as she faced downtown. Gossip, her gentle insistence that lies could be fought with truth rather than fists. The eastern sky began to lighten, turning the clouds pewter gray. Robert's horse, lathered with sweat, climbed the last ridge before Pike's ranch. From here, he could see the first smoke from the land agent's chimney. Pike would be rising now, probably congratulating himself on his victory. Robert raised his rifle, testing its familiar weight. One shot would end it all, would end the lies, the manipulation, the constant pressure to sell his land. His finger trembled on the trigger guard. Then another memory surfaced. Bee reading from her Bible by lamplight, her voice soft but steady. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." He had pretended not to listen, but her words had settled into his heart like seeds. He remembered her face when she discovered the letters from the previous brides, how she had seen through Pike's schemes immediately. "You were not the cause," she had said. "Lies were." She had urged him then to fight with truth rather than fists. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Robert sat motionless on his horse, rifle still raised, as the sun crept over the horizon. Pike's ranch house lay below, peaceful in the morning light. One shot would change everything. But would it change things for the better? Or would it only prove Pike's lies about him true? Bee's voice came to him again, hoarse from smoke, but clear with conviction. "This is what he wants." Robert's hands began to shake. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He lowered it slowly, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the rage that had driven him through the night began to crack and crumble. Bee had not run when the town whispered about him. She had not fled when Pike mocked her. She had stayed, fighting with quiet dignity and unwavering faith. She had defended him not with violence, but with truth, searching records, finding proof of his water rights, standing beside him before the townspeople. And how had he repaid her courage? By charging off for revenge, leaving her injured and alone. Shame washed through him, dousing the last embers of his fury. He turned his horse away from Pike's ranch, pointing the animal's head toward town instead. The county seat had a sheriff, a judge, proper channels for justice. Bee had found proof of his water rights, proof that would stand in court. Pike's schemes could be exposed legally, his lies brought to light before the whole community. As Robert rode toward town, his heart gradually steadied. The rifle, now secured in its scabbard, no longer called to him with promises of quick vengeance. The sun warmed his back, reminding him of mornings in the cabin, watching Bee turn simple cornmeal into fresh bread, her presence somehow making the rough homestead feel like home for the first time in years. Meanwhile, miles away, Bee lay in the home of Sarah Jenkins, their nearest neighbor. The kind-faced woman had found Bee near the burned cabin and brought her to safety. Now Bee tossed in fever-racked sleep, her burned arm carefully bandaged but still causing her pain. The quilt she had rescued from the fire lay across her legs, Robert's mother's quilt, one of the few pieces of his past she had managed to save. Her fingers clutched its familiar patterns even in sleep, drawing comfort from the connection to the man she had come to care for so deeply. Despite her weakness, Bee's lips moved in constant prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice rough from smoke, "keep him from bloodshed. Don't let Pike's evil poison his heart. Show him a better path." Sarah Jenkins moved quietly around the sick room, changing cool cloths on Bee's forehead, offering sips of water when she stirred. The older woman had heard stories about Robert Rourke for years, his isolation, his gruffness, the brides who never stayed. But watching Bee pray for him now, seeing the depth of her concern for his soul rather than her own injuries, made Sarah wonder if perhaps the town had judged the mountain man too harshly. "He's a good man," Bee murmured, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever but determined. "He just needs to remember it himself." "Rest now," Sarah soothed, adjusting the quilt. "Your arm needs healing." But Bee continued to pray, her words sometimes clear, sometimes slipping into fevered mumbling. Always they centered on Robert, not for his safety, but for his spirit. She asked God to guide him away from darkness, to help him choose justice over vengeance, to show him that violence would only feed the lies Pike had spread about him. The morning sun climbed higher, streaming through Sarah's windows. Bee's fever still burned, but her prayers never ceased. She held on to Robert's mother's quilt like an anchor, as if by keeping this piece of his past safe, she could somehow help guide him toward a better future. And somewhere between her and town, Robert rode with squared shoulders and clear eyes, leaving thoughts of revenge behind. His mind turned instead to legal documents, proper channels, and the truth Bee had helped him uncover. Pike's days of manipulation were numbered, not through violence, but through justice. The rifle stayed in its scabbard, silent and unused, as hoofbeats carried Robert toward a different kind of victory, one that would have made Bee proud. The church bell rang clear across Silver Bluff that Sunday morning, its bronze voice echoing off the mountains. Townsfolk in their Sunday best made their way up the wooden steps, nodding to each other and sharing quiet greetings. The territorial judge, a distinguished visitor passing through on his circuit, sat near the front, his black coat pristine. Gideon Pike settled into his usual pew, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. He had heard whispers that the Rourke cabin burned 2 nights ago. Another bride would flee. Another piece of prime water rights would soon be his. He straightened his silk vest, content in his schemes. The congregation had just finished the first hymn when bootsteps thundered on the church porch. The double doors swung wide, letting in a shaft of morning light. Robert Rourke stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow down the center aisle. Gasps rippled through the church. Robert's clothes were trail-dusty, his face dark with 2 days' stubble. His eyes were red-rimmed from sleepless riding, but they blazed with purpose. In his hand, he clutched a rolled parchment. "He's gone mad," someone whispered. "Lost his mind after the fire." Robert strode down the aisle, his spurs jingling in the sudden silence. The pastor stopped mid-prayer, mouth open. But Robert's attention was fixed on the territorial judge. "Your Honor," Robert's voice was hoarse but carried to every corner. "I ask the court's attention. There's been theft and arson in this territory." Pike half rose, his face darkening. "This is a house of God, Rourke. Your wild accusations are backed by law." Robert unfurled the survey map on the judge's pew. "This is the original territory survey, signed and sealed 15 years ago. It shows clear water rights granted to my land." The judge leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. The morning light through the windows illuminated the aged parchment, its official seals and careful markings clear to all nearby. "These signatures appear authentic," the judge said slowly. "Where did you obtain this document?" "My wife found it." Robert's voice caught slightly on the word wife. "In the church records, before our cabin was burned?" A murmur ran through the congregation. Sarah Jenkins, sitting near the back, spoke up. "His wife lies fevered in my home, Your Honor. She risked her life saving his mother's quilt when the cabin burned." The judge's eyes narrowed as he studied the map. "These water rights are indeed legally recorded. Mr. Pike, you filed several claims disputing this land. How do you explain this original survey?" Pike stood, straightening his vest. "Clearly a forgery. Rourke is desperate, Your Honor. His past brides all fled, knowing his violent nature." "They fled because of lies," Robert's voice thundered. "Lies you spread trying to drive me off my land. But this time you went too far. You nearly killed an innocent woman." The judge held up the survey, pointing to specific markings. "These territorial seals are genuine. The signatures match our records." He turned stern eyes on Pike. "Did you know of this document when you filed your claims?" Pike's confident smile faltered. In the pews behind him, his hired men began to shift uneasily. They had signed on for intimidation, for burning an empty cabin. Legal proceedings were another matter. "Your Honor," Pike tried again, "Rourke threatens decent folk." "Just look at him, bursting into church, wild-eyed." "With evidence," the judge cut in. "Legal evidence." He stood, his authority filling the small church. "Mr. Pike, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into your land claims. If arson is proven..." Pike's hired men didn't wait to hear more. They rose and slipped toward the doors, unwilling to stand beside their employer as his schemes unraveled. Pike watched them go, his face reddening. "These are baseless accusations," Pike sputtered. "I am a respected businessman." "Who filed false claims," the judge said firmly. "The territorial court takes a very dim view of document fraud, Mr. Pike, and arson is a hanging offense." The congregation sat in stunned silence. Many had believed Pike's whispers about Robert over the years, had shunned the quiet mountain man as dangerous. Now they saw him standing straight-backed before the law, armed not with a rifle, but with truth. Robert kept his eyes on Pike, watching the man's bluster crumble. It would have been easier, perhaps, to settle things with violence. But B's way, fighting lies with truth, standing firm with dignity, had proven stronger than any bullet. "Your Honor," Robert said quietly, "I don't seek revenge. Just justice. Let the law prove what's right." The judge nodded gravely. "You'll have it, Mr. Rourke." "The court will hear full evidence tomorrow morning." He turned to the sheriff, who sat near the front. "Meanwhile, ensure Mr. Pike remains in town." Pike's face had gone ashen. His schemes had always relied on shadows, on whispered lies and midnight intimidation. Brought into the light of law and truth, they withered like morning frost. The pastor cleared his throat. Perhaps we should pray for wisdom and justice." But Robert was already turning toward the door. He had done what he came to do. The law would handle Pike now. His wife, his true, brave wife, needed him more than he needed to watch Pike's downfall. As he strode out of the church, heads turned to follow him. But the whispers were different now. Gone was the fear, the judgment. In its place was a growing respect for a man who chose justice over vengeance, truth over violence. The morning sun was bright as Robert mounted his horse. He could hear the congregation breaking into hymn behind him, their voices carrying across the town square. But his thoughts were already turning toward Sarah Jenkins' house, where Bee lay healing. She had believed in him when no one else would, had shown him a better path than bitterness and isolation, had fought for him not with fists, but with faith and determination. Now it was his turn to prove worthy of that faith, to show her that her courage had not been wasted, that together they could build something stronger than Pike's lies had ever threatened. The horse's hooves struck a steady rhythm as Robert rode toward his wife, leaving the whispers and schemes behind. Pike's power was broken, shattered not by bullets but by the simple power of truth brought into light. The church doors opened wide as the congregation spilled out into the bright mountain morning. Robert stood apart, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dusty street. He had expected to leave town immediately, to escape the stares and whispers that had haunted him for years, but something had shifted in the air, like the change that comes before spring thaw. Martha Wilson, the miller's wife who had once crossed the street to avoid him, approached with hesitant steps, her hands twisted in her Sunday shawl. "Mr. Rourke," she said softly, we didn't know. About Mr. Pike's scheming, I mean." Robert nodded stiffly, unused to gentle words from townsfolk. Before he could retreat, Thomas Cooper, the blacksmith, stepped forward. "My barn's empty since my boy moved west. You and the missus are welcome there while you rebuild." "Got spare lumber at my mill," Jacob Wilson added, his wife nodding beside him. "Won't take but a day to cut what you need." More townspeople gathered, offering what they could. Sarah Peterson mentioned extra quilts. The general store owner spoke of credit for supplies. Each offer felt like a stone being lifted from Robert's shoulders, years of isolation crumbling away. The pastor emerged from the church, his Bible tucked under one arm. His face was grave as he approached Robert. "Brother Rourke," he said loud enough for all to hear. "I've known Gideon Pike for 15 years. Never trusted him, but never had proof of his dealings." He shook his head sadly. "The church ledgers show more than just your survey. There are altered documents, false testimonies. Pike's guilt is clear as day." Robert's hands clenched at his sides. "You'll support my filing with the territorial court." "Every step of the way," the pastor assured him. "Pike's manipulations end now." But Robert's thoughts had already turned elsewhere. The offers of help, the pastor's support, none of it mattered as much as one thing. He cleared his throat roughly. "Much obliged, but there's only one thing I need." His voice grew quiet but firm. "See to B. She's hurt, bad, saving what she could from the fire." Sarah Jenkins, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "She's at my place, Mr. Rourke. Fever's high, but she's strong." "Strongest woman I ever met," Robert said, the words coming straight from his heart. The town doctor adjusted his spectacles. "We should bring her to town. Better care here, and my wife's a fine nurse." "I'll send my wagon," Thomas Cooper offered. "Got fresh straw and blankets. It'll be gentle as a cradle." Robert watched as the townsfolk organized themselves. Women hurried home to gather healing supplies and soft bedding. Men hitched horses to Cooper's wagon. Children were sent running with messages. The same community that had shunned him for years now moved with purpose to help his wife. The morning stretched into afternoon. Robert paced the doctor's porch, watching the road. Every few minutes, someone would bring him water or offer a kind word. He barely heard them. His mind was with Bea, remembering how she had rushed into the burning cabin to save his mother's quilt and Bible. How she had collapsed in his arms, coughing from the smoke, her sleeve charred. Finally, hooves and wheels sounded on the packed earth. Cooper's wagon appeared, moving slowly to avoid jostling its precious cargo. Robert's heart clenched when he saw Bea lying on the fresh straw, wrapped in quilts. Her round face was pale, but her eyes were open, alert. When she saw Robert waiting, a weak smile touched her lips. Despite the doctor hovering nearby, despite the crowd of onlookers, Robert strode to the wagon and took her hand. Her fingers were warm with fever but gripped his firmly. "You're supposed to be in church," she whispered hoarsely. "Been there already." Robert's voice was gruff with emotion. "Showed them Pike's true nature, just like you wanted. No violence, just truth." Bea's smile grew stronger. "Proud of you." Robert lifted her himself from the wagon, cradling her solid frame as tenderly as if she were made of glass. He carried her up the doctor's steps, not caring who saw the tears in his eyes or the gentleness in his weathered hands. Along the boardwalk, the same women who had whispered cruel jokes about Bee's size now watched in awe. They saw how Robert held her, how his hard face softened when she patted his cheek. They remembered their own mocking words about how long she would last, and shame colored their faces. 2 months, Martha Wilson murmured to her friend. She stayed when we all said she'd run. Stayed and fought for him, Sarah Peterson added. Not just against Pike, but against our own ugly gossip. Fought with dignity, too, the pastor's wife noted. Never a harsh word back, just that quiet strength. The doctor's wife had prepared a clean bed by the window. As Robert laid Bee down carefully, she kept hold of his hand. Her brown eyes met his, full of the same steady courage that had faced down every challenge since stepping off that stagecoach. The whole town's offering help, Robert told her softly. Lumber, supplies, labor. Reckon we could have the cabin rebuilt before first snow. We. Bee's voice was weak but teasing. Not trying to scare me off anymore? Robert's throat tightened. He glanced at the doorway, where townsfolk were gathering with offers of soup and medicine. For years he had hidden from their judgment, letting Pike's lies isolate him. Now, watching his wife's brave smile, he understood what she had known all along. The truth could rebuild more than just a cabin. No more scaring, he promised. You proved yourself right here to stay. The doctor's wife shooed everyone out then, insisting Bee needed rest. But word spread through town quickly, about how Robert Rourke had carried his wife so tenderly, about how she had smiled up at him with such trust, about how love, tested by fire and lies, had emerged stronger than ever. The town buzzed with activity that afternoon. Women organized meals and medical supplies. Men drew up plans for rebuilding. Children were sent to gather late summer berries for preserves. Each small gesture was an apology of sorts, an acknowledgement of how they had misjudged both Robert and Bee. Through it all, Robert sat by Bee's bedside, holding her hand as she dozed. He had spent so many years alone in his mountain cabin, bitter and defensive. Now, watching his wife sleep, feeling the town rally around them, he understood what Bee had been teaching him all along, that real strength wasn't in isolation or anger, but in the courage to let others in. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, touching Bee's face with golden light. Her fever was already dropping, the doctor said. Like everything else about her, her body was stubborn, determined to heal. Robert squeezed her hand gently, thanking God for sending him not the wife he thought he wanted, but the one he truly needed. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's main street as wagons began arriving, loaded with supplies. Rough-cut lumber stretched beyond cart beds, and burlap sacks bulged with nails and tools. Women carried baskets of food and blankets, while children darted between the adults, eager to help. Sarah Peterson organized the supplies in neat piles near the doctor's house, where Bee still rested. "Mind those nails, Jimmy," she called to her son. "Miss Bethany will need everyone for the new cabin." Inside, Bee sat propped against pillows, her burned arm carefully bandaged. Though still pale, determination brightened her eyes as she studied the building plans Robert and the men had drawn up. The doctor's wife had tried to make her rest, but Bee insisted on reviewing every detail. "The kitchen window should face east," she told Robert when he came to check on her. "For the morning light while I'm cooking." Robert nodded, making a mark on the rough sketch. His weathered face softened as he watched her. "You should be resting." "I'll rest better knowing things are done right." Bee's round face creased in a smile. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you men don't forget the important things." Outside, hammers already rang against wood as the men began preparing the foundation logs. Robert hesitated, torn between staying with Bee and joining the work. She shooed him away with her good hand. "Go on. I'll be out there soon enough myself." By mid-morning, Bee had convinced the doctor to let her sit in a cushioned chair near the building site. The women had set up a cooking area nearby, and the smell of coffee and baking bread drifted across the clearing. Bee directed traffic with cheerful authority, making sure the foundation was laid exactly as she wanted it. "Those support beams need to be a mite closer together," she called out. "Winter storms are fierce up here." Robert watched in amazement as men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now worked alongside him, passing tools and holding boards steady. Jacob Wilson, who owned the lumber mill, showed him a better way to notch the logs. Thomas Cooper's teenage sons competed to see who could carry the heaviest loads. The pastor arrived with more volunteers, rolling up his sleeves to help. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, helping Robert lift a heavy beam. "Sometimes it takes a good woman to show us the path to reconciliation." As the sun climbed higher, the cabin's walls began to take shape. Women took turns bringing water to the workers and sitting with Bee, who dozed occasionally but always woke to check the progress. Her quilt lay across her lap, a reminder of what she had risked to save it from the fire. "You've got backbone, Mrs. Rourke," Martha Wilson said, bringing her a cup of tea. "Standing up to Pike, saving what matters most." Bee touched the quilt gently. "Sometimes the things that seem broken just need someone to believe in them." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Children gathered stones for the new hearth while their mothers cleaned them. Men raised the walls log by log, following Bee's careful instructions about where to place the windows and door. Even those who had once whispered about her size now sought her approval, noting how her practical suggestions improved their work. As dusk approached, Sarah Peterson organized a meal for everyone. Tables were set up near Bee's chair, loaded with fried chicken, cornbread, and fresh pies. The autumn air grew crisp, and someone built a fire in a stone circle nearby. Bee watched the flames dance, remembering the destructive fire that had taken their first home. But this fire was different. It brought warmth and light, drawing people together instead of driving them apart. An idea formed in her mind. "Would anyone like to sing?" she asked, her voice carrying across the gathering. "My mama always said work goes better with praise." There was a moment of awkward silence. Then the pastor's wife began softly, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." One by one, voices joined in. Women who had gossiped about Bee now stood shoulder to shoulder, harmonizing on the old hymn. Men who had doubted Robert removed their hats, singing bass notes that rumbled like distant thunder. Children's high, clear voices soared above the rest. Robert stood behind Bee's chair, one hand resting on her shoulder. He hadn't sung in church since his parents died, but now the familiar words came back to him. "Was blind, but now I see." The hymn ended, but another began immediately. "Rock of Ages," Bee's favorite. She sang despite her weakness, her voice steady and true. More songs followed, filling the gathering darkness with hope and harmony. Between songs, Robert squeezed Bee's shoulder gently. She reached up to cover his hand with hers, their fingers intertwining where everyone could see. No one whispered or looked away. Instead, smiles appeared on faces all around the fire. The pastor stepped forward as the singing faded. "Shall we thank the Lord for this day of blessing?" Heads bowed all around the circle. Robert hesitated, then slowly lowered his head. Bee's hand tightened on his as the pastor began to pray. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing this community together, for showing us that love and truth are stronger than hatred and lies, for sending us Bee Bethany Rourke, whose courage and faith have taught us all to look past our prejudices and see with clearer eyes." "Amen," multiple voices responded when he finished. Robert's deep "Amen" joined them, surprising himself. As the evening grew cooler, people began gathering their tools and dishes to head home. Many promised to return the next day to continue working. The new cabin was already waist-high, its solid walls promising shelter and comfort once completed. "You need proper rest tonight," the doctor told Bee firmly. No more overseeing until morning." Bee nodded, suddenly tired but content. Robert draped her saved quilt around her shoulders, its familiar weight comforting. Though the doctor had offered to let them stay another night, Robert wanted to keep watch over the new cabin site. "We'll sleep in Cooper's wagon," he said. "Got it filled with fresh straw and blankets." The wagon had been positioned near the building site, its bed transformed into a cozy nest. Robert lifted Bee carefully, carrying her to the wagon as he had done earlier at the doctor's house. But this time, instead of worry, his face showed quiet gratitude. He settled her in the soft straw, making sure the quilt covered her well. The evening air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Bee touched Robert's cheek gently. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. Robert caught her hand and held it. "Neither are you." As Bee drifted off to sleep, Robert sat beside the wagon, his rifle across his knees more from habit than necessity. The new cabin's walls rose dark against the starlit sky, a promise of home restored. But more than the building had been restored that day. Robert watched his wife sleep, remembering how she had refused to leave when he gave her the chance that first night. The whippoorwill called again, and a cool breeze stirred the trees. Robert pulled his coat tighter, settling in for his watch. But unlike the lonely vigils of his past, this night was filled with peace. Tomorrow would bring more work, more singing, more healing. For now, he was content to guard his wife's rest and count the blessings she had brought into his life. The mountain winter had settled in, bringing deep snow and long nights. Inside the newly rebuilt cabin, lamplight cast a warm glow across fresh-hewn walls and carefully placed windows. The room smelled of pine wood and fresh bread, with hints of coffee lingering from supper. Robert and Bee sat together at their new table, a sturdy piece crafted by the pastor himself as a gift for the couple. Steam rose from their cups as they finished the last bites of Bee's venison stew. The fireplace crackled, sending shadows dancing across the spotless floor. Rising slowly, Robert walked to the corner where his rifle had stood guard for so many years. Without a word, he lifted it and hung it high on pegs near the ceiling. Turning to Bee, his weathered face softened. "Don't reckon I'll be needing this for vengeance anymore," he said quietly. "Got better things to protect now." Bee's laugh rang out like church bells on Sunday morning, clear and joyful. The sound caught Robert by surprise, and he found himself laughing too, a deep, rusty chuckle that seemed to shake years of loneliness from his shoulders. Moving to her side, Robert took her hand in his. The firelight played across their faces as he whispered, "No bride ever stayed. Until you." Bee squeezed his fingers gently. "I told you. I'm too stubborn," she replied, her eyes twinkling. Outside, snow continued to fall silently over the mountains. But inside their cabin, Robert and Bee had found what they'd both been seeking. A home filled with warmth, faith, and the quiet triumph of enduring love. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.